Imagine walking through the grand streets of ancient Alexandria, the jewel of the Mediterranean. Ships from Greece, Egypt, Rome, and beyond glide into the harbour, their sails billowing in the salty air. The scent of spices, papyrus, and incense drifts through the city's bustling markets. At its heart, rising like a beacon above it all, stands a place unlike any other, the great Library of Alexandria. It was here knowledge itself was a treasure, and Alexandria was its vault. Within those marble halls, scholars debated the nature of the universe. Astronomers charted the stars. Mathematicians unlocked patterns in nature. Physicians studied the human body. And poets, philosophers, and historians preserved the memory of entire civilizations. It was said that the library held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the sum of human understanding gathered from across the known world. A monument to curiosity and intellect in an age still half ruled by superstition. But then it was gone, burned, destroyed, vanished. And with it, perhaps, the knowledge of worlds we can only dream of. Today, we journey back to Alexandria to uncover the truth behind one of history's greatest mysteries. What really was lost when the Library of Alexandria fell? And more importantly, did it ever really truly die?
And realism impelled me to admit that we still have a long, long way to go. But I think the important thing is that we are making progress.
También hay que esclarecer que no solamente en
It's been a long
relaciones
journey. I hope you also agree that it has been so far a fruitful one.
for man. Tôi đồng bào cả nước, tất cả mọi người đều sinh ra có quyền bình đẳng.
Seven, six, five, four, three, two, one.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. And just before we begin, I just want to say a heartfelt thank you to everyone who has followed me in the last week or so, both on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube as well. So a big shout out to you there, and for also the people who have supported me on Patreon as well. Again, a huge thank you. It really does contribute to the show. Again, this is all self-funded from me as well. There's no sponsors here. It's just a passion and a love, and I love doing it. I love talking about history, and I love showcasing all of the Irish history and beyond that as well. And if you like what you hear and see, and you want to support the show, please feel free to um, donate whatever you want, basically on Patreon, and you can also suggest what I talk about on the podcast as well. So feel free to leave a comment there as well, and I'll get back to it. So let's begin with the birth of Alexandria. Okay, so Alexandria was founded in 331 BCE by Alexander the Great, fresh from conquering Egypt. However, he never lived to see its full development. But it wasn't just another city. It was designed to be the capital of knowledge, actually, and it was a bridge between East and West. And when Alexander died young, his vast empire fractured, and Egypt fell into the hands of one of his generals, or Diotiechi as well, which meant successors. And the first successor was Ptolemy I Soter. Now, Ptolemy wasn't just a ruler, he was a visionary, you could say. He wanted Alexandria to be the intellectual heart of the world, a city that could rival Athens in philosophy, Babylon in science, and Memphis in tradition. So he conceived that, he conceived an institution that had never existed before, a place not merely to store knowledge, but to actually create it. This ended up being the Mosaic, the birth of the Mosaic, or Temple of the Muses, and within it, the legendary Library of Alexandria. Now, it could have been, there's some discussion around this. Was it Ptolemy, or was it possibly his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus in the early 3rd century BCE who created these. But nonetheless, it was around that time anyway. So, unlike earlier archives, which served kings or temples, the Library of Alexandria was an intellectual powerhouse, and it was sponsored by the state, but open to scholars from across the world. It wasn't just a building filled with scrolls, it was a living research institute as we would look at it nowadays. Scholars were housed and fed at the public expense. They were expected to write, debate, and lecture. The library employed scribes, translators, and librarians who collected texts in multiple languages, such as they would have had Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Hebrew, and also Sanskrit as well. Now, the Ptolemies, particularly Ptolemy II, who we talked about, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, he sent agents to every port in the Mediterranean, ordering them to seize any books or scrolls found on arriving ships, any of the docking ships there. And these texts were occupied and copied by professional scribes. And then the originals were kept in Alexandria, but the copies were returned to their respectful owners. Now, this was the first systematic attempt to collect all knowledge under one roof, and for a time, they nearly succeeded as well. Ancient sources describe, huge numbers. Estimates for the Library of Alexandria's collection varied greatly, basically, ranging from about 200 to 700,000 scrolls. Ancient writers like Aulus Gellius and Aminius Marcellinus mentioned these figures, though they may have mixed up different events or libraries, according to historians as well. So the daughter of the library, it was called the Daughter Library at the Serapeum, served as a secondary centre to Alexandria. And it was said by Johannes Cestus to contain around, it was somewhere around 42,500, 42,800, I believe, scrolls. But later accounts suggest that it may have held tens of thousands more. Some people even mention up to 200,000 after the main library's decline. But you can imagine the contents within these libraries as well. The complete works of Sophocles, the Euripides, the lost plays of Aeschylus, early treatises by Pythagoras, histories of vanished empires like Babylon and Persia, and perhaps even sacred texts from beyond Egypt as well. The library wasn't just Greek knowledge; it was global knowledge, drawn from Africa, the Middle East, Asia, the known world basically at the time. Now, some of the greatest minds of the ancient world walked its halls. You had Euclid, the father of geometry, the Elements. That was one of the books that he wrote. He wrote the Elements, and here the foundation of modern mathematics. Then you have Eratosthenes, the chief librarian. He used, shadows and sticks to calculate the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy. I'm going to list a few here, but we will get into a little bit more detail about some of them as well. You have Herophilus, an early anatomist that dissected human bodies. It was, of course, shocking times, not just then, but it always is really, I suppose, but particularly for then. But he was, renowned for mapping the nervous system. Then you have Callimachus, created the world's first library catalogue, dividing works into genres and authors. And he was basically a forerunner of the Dewey Decimal System as well. Then you have Archimedes, though based in Syracuse, corresponded with Alexandria scholars, exchanging ideas that still really echo in physics today as well. This was more than just a library. It was a network of genius. It was, you could say, the Google, the NASA, the Harvard of the ancient world, all combined into one. Now, the Library of Alexandria represented something radical, the belief that knowledge could unify humanity. In an age when empires conquered by force, Alexandria sought to conquer by curiosity. It symbolized intellectual freedom, the idea that all truth was worth preserving, no matter its origin. It was, in every sense, a beacon. And like, all great beacons, it drew not only scholars, but I think, jealousy and, in this case, fire. Okay, so the destruction of the Library of Alexandria is often told as a single tragic moment, a spark that consumed the world's knowledge. But in truth, it was a slow death by, you could say, 1,000 cuts, spread over centuries. The first great blow came in 48 BCE during the Roman Civil War, and it was Julius Caesar, pursued by the forces of Pompey, found himself besieged in Alexandria. Now, to defend his fleet, Caesar actually ordered the ships in the harbour to be set ablaze. It was a tactical move meant to, stop the Egyptians from surrounding them. But the flames spread quickly, leaping from ship to ship, to dock, and then to the warehouses filled with all of the papyrus scrolls. And from there, according to ancient sources, to the library itself. Now, historians disagree on the extent of the damage. Some say the fire destroyed 40,000 scrolls, others say it was only part of the collection. But one thing is certain: Alexandria's greatest treasure had been seriously wounded at this stage. After the fire, you had Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies. She sought to restore what had been lost. She supposedly received, over 200,000 scrolls from the Library of Pergamon, which is in modern day Turkey, as a gift from, her lover and Roman ally, Mark Antony. I actually did a reel on that a long way back on my social media channels. You'll find it there if you want to have a look. But whether the story is a fact of, is a fact or propaganda, it tells us something important. Even in ruin, the library's prestige remained unmatched. To own the library was to own civilization's memory. And evidence suggests that the library survived in some form afterward. Its decline was due to a combination of factors. You had, political instability, such as the Ptolemy the seventh expulsion of scholars in 145 BCE. We'll talk about that later. You had loss of royal and imperial funding, especially during the Roman period. You had religious conflicts, including the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE, and then competition from rising centers as well, like Rome and Athens. But we'll get into them now lately, a little bit later as well. Now, to talk about the daughter library, the rebuilt collection was housed, at least in part, in the Serapeum. It was a magnificent temple dedicated to Serapis, a Greco-Egyptian god uniting Greek rationalism and Egyptian mysticism. Now, the Serapeum's daughter library, as it was called, continued to thrive for centuries. Scholars still came to Alexandria, knowledge still flowed through its corridors, but political tides were shifting and new powers were also rising as well. Now, when Rome took control of Egypt in 30 BCE, the world was changing. The last Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra VII, was dead, and with her the dream of an independent Egyptian kingdom. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, the Ptolemaic kingdom basically came to an end, marking the fall of the final Hellenistic successor state of Alexander the Great's empire. After her defeat by Rome, Egypt was then absorbed as a Roman province. It was actually known as the Jewel province as well. And the vision, of this independent Egyptian kingdom, whether ruled by so-called native or Greek dynasties, completely disappeared. But Rome, for all its power, didn't quite understand Alexandria. To the Romans, libraries were trophies of conquest, symbols of culture and authority, not living institutions or of discovery or anything like that. And so began really a slow, quiet decline of the library. The library still existed, but it no longer actually breathed its full potential either. Under Roman rule, the Library of Alexandria was no longer enjoyed, steady funding or full independence like it once had. While early emperors like Augustus offered some support, the patronage gradually faded. Over time, scholars were chosen less for their intellect and more for their political loyalty, signaling basically the library's, slow decline. The city's governor now represented Caesar, not the muses like it once had. Scholars found themselves navigating, a world between knowledge served politics and not curiosity. They try to get on the good side of the politics, basically. Now, while this was all ongoing, there was still, some brilliance remained. You had figures like, as we talked about earlier, Hero of Alexandria continued to dazzle with invention. Hero's writing describe early versions of steam engines, automatic doors, and mechanical puppets powered by air and water pressure, centuries ahead of their time. It was actually amazing. A lot of the stuff that was looked at again during the Renaissance period came from this time. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about it soon. But, there were mathematicians, astronomers, doctors still working in the Alexandrian tradition, but their purpose had shifted. They were now preserving what was taught and learned instead of actually pioneering it. So there was a huge difference there as well. It was basically the age of open exploration, the age of wonder. It really did start to dim at this stage. By the first century CE, it's likely that the original Great Library attached to the Museum was already gone or severely diminished. Once again, you had fires, political instability, and years of neglect had left their mark on the library. Now, after the Great Library's decline, knowledge lived on in, you could say, scattered forms. Wealthy Romans maintained private libraries, collecting scrolls both for study and status. The Serapeum, home to the daughter library that we talked about, continued as a kind of hub of learning until its destruction in 391 CE was, 391. Meanwhile, you had philosophers, physicians, and scholars across the Mediterranean traded and copied texts. And they basically were, helping preserve much of the ancient world's wisdom. Though the era of centralized learning had ended, the library spirit survived, echoing through later centers of scholarship like the Byzantine and Islamic libraries that followed. Now, this fragmentation mirrored the broader fate of Alexandria itself. Once a beacon of unity, now a crossroads of competing cultures: Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and soon Christian as well. Now, it's easy to imagine Rome as a destroyer of knowledge, but the truth is far more complex. Rome respected Greek learning, it just didn't revere where it came from. Roman emperors like Augustus and Hadrian admired the scholars of old and even established libraries across the empire, but none could, match the original ambition of Alexandria. It was just a different mindset that it had. Rome was practical, it prized law, it prized engineering and order, not the boundless curiosity that had defined the Hellenistic age. So that was a big difference. And so while Rome's roads, aqueducts, and legions spread across the known world, the light of philosophy and science burned beneath the surface. So, you see when you go to any of the countries that had Roman influence on in the past, you can see the remnants of Rome. Like we said, the aqueducts, the different buildings, the columns, the towers, everything like that. But it's what you don't see is what the Romans actually destroyed in a sense. Then you had the second blow, which was the uprising of Aurelian. By the 3rd century CE, Alexandria was no longer the serene capital of learning it once was. Civil wars, rebellions, religious conflict tore through the city. And it was in 270 CE the Roman Emperor Aurelian fought to crush the rebellion of Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, whose forces had occupied Alexandria as well. I think I did actually a reel on Palmyra when I was in Syria. I toured Palmyra. I was there with a group of other people who were so curious about the history of the place. You had the White Helmets, a group who were going throughout the area, clearing the area of mines that were left there by ISIS. So there were some parts of it that were still not safe for us to go to, but we did enter into Palmyra, and it's an absolutely amazing place. Even though ISIS had completely destroyed one of the temples there as well. I'd actually like to do an episode on that, and I will do it. But yeah, we were in the theater also where ISIS had, civilians and members of the opposition forces and beheaded them there as well. So that's even recent history to it. But yeah, I think I'll do an episode on that probably for next week or the week after, and I'll get more into it. So let's get back to this one then as well. So it was actually during the fighting that of Queen Zenobia and so on that large parts of the Bruttian district where the Great Library had once stood were destroyed. You had ancient sources like Ammianus Marcellinus tell us that the area housing the Mausoleum was entirely burned. If any remnants of the original library still survived, this may have been their end. But not all was lost either. Even after Aurelian's campaign, the Serapeum's daughter library endured. It continued to host scholars, teachers, keepers, basically keeping it alive. And what they could as well, they did. It's a reminder, I think, that the story of the library's fall wasn't one of sudden death like we talked about. It was one of, slow erosion, death by 1,000 cuts, and knowledge, after all, rarely vanishes in fire alone. It's usually preserved by word of mouth passing on. It fades when it's, in my opinion, I think knowledge fades when it's no longer valued. And I think the Great Library didn't just burn, it was forgotten. And in forgetting, the world lost more than words just on parchment. And it is a lost way of thinking, in my opinion. So, in terms of, context of the shifting of the mind, by the time of the later Roman Empire, a profound culture shift was underway. Philosophy gave way to theology, observation gave way to faith, and soon the old gods and old wisdom of Alexandria would meet their greatest challenge to date: the rise of Christianity. By the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire was transforming. Where once Jupiter, Isis, and Serapis had ruled the hearts of men, now a new faith was spreading through the streets: Christianity. At first, it was the religion of the oppressed, persecuted, driven underground, sustained by hope and martyrdom. But then, in 313 CE, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting Christians the freedom to worship openly. And it was just a few decades later, Christianity became the official religion of the empire. It was the dawn, you could say, of a new spiritual order and the dusk of the old intellectual one. Now, while Alexandria became a battleground of beliefs, it was one of the most diverse cities on earth, home to Greeks, Romans, Jews, Egyptians, and now Christian converts. But that diversity, once its strength, now became its undoing. The old temples, once symbols of divine reason and harmony, were seen by many Christian leaders as centres of pagan heresy. The scholars who had studied philosophy and science were viewed with suspicion, their devotion to inquiry mistaken for pride or blasphemy. The great Serapeum, home to the last daughter library, stood at the centre of this storm. The Serapeum was no mere temple. It was, a marvel of marble and light, standing high above the rocks in Rakotis. Now, inside were the usual stuff that you'd have, towering columns, statues, and alcoves filled with scrolls and manuscripts. And it was, you could say, the last echo of the ancient world's dream, a place where reason and art and spirituality all coexisted. But to the growing Christian movement, it represented everything they had fought to overthrow: idol worship, false gods, and pagan arrogance. And in 391 CE, that conflict reached its breaking point. That year, it was Emperor Theodosius I issued an edict forbidding pagan worship across the empire. It was the first time that this actually happened. It was in Alexandria the order was enforced by Patriarch Theophilus. Now he was the city's powerful, he was the bishop at the time, Christian bishop. He ordered the destruction of pagan temples, including the Serapeum. Now, when the Christians began to destroy and desecrate the sacred site, riots broke out, as is expected. Pagans, desperate to defend their sanctuary, barricaded themselves inside the Serapeum, and they resisted fiercely. And for a brief moment, the old gods made their final stand. But the emperor's will was the final say. He was absolute in this. Troops eventually stormed the hill. They tore down the idols of Serapis and set the temple ablaze. Now, you have ancient sources saying that, including to the historian, actually, Socrates, described the destruction, in painful detail. He said the flames consumed the last remnants of the library scrolls. The statues of Serapis were dragged through the streets and smashed. So, completely destroyed by the Christians as well, which we'll probably never see again, any of that stuff. But the Serapeum once, was once the greatest sanctuary of learning, was basically reduced to rubble. And that was the last light, really, of Alexandria had gone dark, in my opinion. Now, the fall of Serapeum wasn't simply an act of violence. It was really a symbolic transformation of the ways the intellectual world of Greece and Egypt, built on debate, curiosity, and reason, gave way to a world guided by faith and divine revelation, which we'll see a lot of that, I suppose, in the Middle Ages as well. Knowledge, once celebrated as a path to truth, became something to be controlled and even feared as well. In a single generation, when you think about it, Alexandria shifted from the city of scholars to a city of bishops. So even try and picture something like that today, where, wherever you're listening to this, if you're in a country that's, predominantly Christian or Muslim or Hindu or whatever the case may be, that just in like a flick of a switch, really, when you put that time into perspective of how something you grew up with, your parents, your grandparents, your ancestors grew up with it, just in a flick of a switch, it's a complete new religion, new way of life. But the spirit of Alexandria did not die so easily. Among the ruins, one last figure carried its torch: Hypatia, the philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer who taught in the great schools of the city. Born around 355 CE, Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, a renowned mathematician associated with the old Mosaic tradition. And it was from him, actually, that she inherited a love of reason and a belief that truth could be reached through logic and evidence and not revelation or divine intervention. Now, Hypatia became the most famous philosopher of her age. She lectured on Plato and Aristotle, refined astronomical instruments, and wrote commentaries on Diophantus and Ptolemy, actually, as well. She attracted students from across the Mediterranean, pagan and Christians alike, who came to hear her speak in the open courtyards of Alexandria. Contemporaries described her as eloquent and wise beyond measure, and in an era of rising dogma, she was the last voice of the classical mind. But it was in 415 CE, Alexandria once again tore itself apart. A political feud between the city's Roman governor, Orestes, and the Christian patriarch, Cyril, spiraled into chaos. Hypatia, respected by Orestes and admired by many, was accused by Cyril's followers of sorcery and paganism, of, you could say, bewitching the governor against the church. Again, this is kind of the first time where, the Christians had a woman and killed her because, of sorcery, paganism, bewitching, and we'd see a lot of that a few centuries later and throughout the Middle Ages. But back to her, it was on her death. It was actually one day she rode through the streets in her chariot, and she was intercepted by a mob. They dragged her into a church, the Caesareum, and they brutally murdered her there. Her body was literally torn apart. Her remains burned outside the city walls. So, with her death, the last true heir to the library's spirit was extinguished, the voice of reason silenced by fear. By the early 5th century, Alexandria had changed beyond recognition. Its temples were gone, its scholars were dead or scattered. And though small schools of learning, remained, the great age of inquiry, the dream that began under Ptolemy I, had ended. Yet the idea of the library lived on. In the memories of those who came after, it became a symbol of everything that humanity could achieve and everything it could lose. The fires of faith had destroyed the marble halls, but they could not erase the yearning that built them. It was by the 7th century CE, the ancient world, as Alexandria had known, was gone. The Roman Empire had split into two, the western half long fallen, and the eastern, the Byzantine Empire, clung to its power through faith and fear. The temples of old had been destroyed, the philosophers had vanished. But Alexandria still stood. It was weary, diminished, but it was still watching the horizon. It was still there, And I think from that horizon came a new power, bearing a new faith and a new vision of knowledge. Because it was in 641 CE, the Muslim general Amr ibn al-As, under the command of Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, marched into Egypt. The Byzantine forces were defeated, and after it was a brief siege, Alexandria fell, marking the end of nearly 1,000 years of Greco-Roman rule. The city that had once stood and been the center of the world was now part of a vast and rising Islamic empire stretching from Persia to North Africa. Now, to many Alexandrians, the sight of Arab banners over the city must have seemed like the final page of history turning for them. But what happened next would I think, even spark one of the most enduring and controversial legends in human history. Medieval writers tell a tale. After Alexandria's conquest, the victorious general Amr ibn al-As reportedly came across the remnants of the library, vast halls filled with scrolls and manuscripts, whatever was left over. When he asked what should be done with them, the Caliph Umar allegedly replied, "If the writings of these books agree with the book of God, they are superfluous. If they disagree, they are heretical. Therefore, destroy them." The scrolls, it is said, were distributed to the city's baths, believe it or not, where they were used as fuel for the furnaces. It was said that it was 6 months of fire until nothing remained. It's one of the most devastating, images really in all of history. Knowledge itself burning to just heat up bats, to warm the bats up. But is it true? Is this a fact, or is it just a legend? Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because historians have debated this story for centuries. The account of the, as it's called, Arab destruction first appears 600 years after the conquest. Okay, so it's not a primary source, it's 600 years after the conquest, in writings of Christian chroniclers who were hostile, of course, to Islam. No contemporary Muslim or Byzantine, you could understand if there was no Muslim contemporary account, but Byzantine, you would think there would have been an account. No sources mention it at all. Now, modern scholars believe the story is likely, a later invention. Of course, it wasn't, because it's centuries later, but a later invention that was born from religious rivalry, more so than anything else. It was a way of blaming Islam for what had already been lost before the Arabs arrived. Okay, so maybe, we don't know, maybe a lot of it was destroyed not just by Caesar and the centuries of turmoil, but maybe some of it was destroyed by the Christians as well. When the Christians looked at a lot of the stuff that people were studying there, they looked at it as heresy and so on. So it's more than likely that the Christians did destroy it as well. By the 7th century, the great halls of the library, again, long gone, destroyed by fire, neglect, the whole lot. what they have found was not a grand archive. It was remnants of it, but perhaps a few scattered collections, remnants of Alexandria's school, one of the schools. So while the image of the Caliph Umar burning the library is, poetic from Christianity point of view, it is more than likely a myth. It was a symbol, really, of the library's long, slow death, and not its final act. Ironically, the very civilizations blamed for the library's destruction would become the next great preserver of knowledge. Under the early caliphs, a remarkable transformation took place. From Damascus to Baghdad, Muslim scholars began collecting, translating, and even expanding upon the very works once housed in Alexandria. We had Greek, Persian, and even Indian texts, philosophy, all of it again, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, were rendered into Arabic. Now, this movement, known as the translation movement, laid the foundation for what we now call the Islamic Golden Age. Within a few generations, cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo became the new Alexandrias. They were all the new learning centers of learning, libraries, and light as well. Now, the scholars of the Abbasid Caliphate, names like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, also known as Ibn Sina, and Averroes, also known as Ibn Rushd, carried forward the rational, inquisitive spirit of the Hellenistic world. They studied Aristotle, refined Euclid, advanced astronomy, and preserved Plato. Even the great library of Baghdad's House of Wisdom was modelled on earlier Greek traditions, and its scholars tracing their intellectual lineage back to the lost library of Alexandria. So, in a way, the library never truly died. Physically, yes, but its ideas migrated, they were translated, transformed, crossing languages, faiths, and empires. What was once written in Greek in the marble halls of Alexandria was now studied in Arabic beneath the domes of Baghdad and Cairo. And centuries later, those Arabic texts would be translated again, this time into Latin, and help ignite what we know as the Renaissance. So I suppose the real question, a single out note, Feds, I think it is like perhaps the library's story was never meant to end in fire at all, and perhaps what really died was not the knowledge itself, but our connection to it, our memory of where it began. Because in truth, the Library of Alexandria was never a single building. It was, in a sense, an idea that humanity could gather all of its wisdom in one place, like we have now with the internet. That curiosity could unite civilizations, and the truth, no matter how fragile it could be, could survive across centuries. And I think that idea did survive. I think it survived in Baghdad scholars, in medieval monasteries, in the universities of Europe, and even library and archive built ever since then. So the fire may have burned, the papyrus, but in a sense, it could not burn the dream. So when people hear of the Library of Alexandria, they imagine, like we talked about, a single catastrophic blaze, thousands of scrolls burning, the sum of human wisdom turning to ash. But again, the real tragedy isn't just that it was burned. I think the real tragedy is it's what we'll never know we lost. I think that's really one of the hardest things about it as well, because the library wasn't just a building full of books or anything. It was a living archive of human thought. It contained works from Greece, Egypt, Persia, India. Again, on astronomy, medicine, geography, the whole lot. It was the internet of the ancient world, and when it fell silent, so did the centuries of accumulated knowledge go with it. So let's open the doors of that last world and step inside a bit. So the library is said to have held over 500,000 scrolls. No catalogue survives, but ancient writers give us clues on this. There were the complete works of Aristotle, the philosophical core of the ancient world. There were the mathematical treatises of Euclid, who taught in Alexandria, and the engineering designs of Archimedes. There were early astronomical observations from Babylon and Greece, possibly even um, Indian star maps, now that I think about it, brought by travelers from the East. Now, so, and think about it, this was not just a library of Greek philosophy either. It was a global, I think the correct term would be a global research center for, what they thought the globe was back then, before such a thing even existed. It was a place where scholars debated the structure of the cosmos, the size of the earth, the laws of motion, the nature of the human soul, and so on. And among its lost treasures, in my opinion, were works that, could have rewritten the story of science itself. One of the greatest tragedies of Alexandria's destruction was the disappearance of Hellenistic science, a field far more advanced than we once thought. You take, I think his name is Eratosthenes. Actually, now that I think about it, Eratosthenes, that he was, we talked about him earlier, the library's chief librarian in the 3rd century BCE. He measured the Earth's circumference using nothing but, shadows and geometry, and astonishingly, for that time, he was so close. He was just off by less than 1%. Now think of how insane that actually is. With the technology we have nowadays, we can look at the planet from space, but he used it by shadows and geometry, and less than 1% he was off. Now imagine what his full treatise might have contained. Detailed maps, mathematical proofs, records of solar and lunar measurements. All of that was gone. Then there was Hipparchus, whose star catalogue, possibly preserved in the library, was the most accurate of the ancient world. He may have even discovered the precision of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that changes our night sky over millennia, basically. I hope I said that right. Equinoxes. I think I said it right. And then you have Aristarchus of Samos, another figure who associated with Alexandria. He proposed something radical. He proposed that the Earth orbited the sun. So for nearly that was before Copernicus actually even said that as well. So when Copernicus said it, it would have been so nearly 1,700 years roughly before Copernicus had said it. Now, if his heliocentric theory had survived widely, I think if those scrolls had been copied, debated, and spread, I think the scientific revolution might have begun a millennium earlier than what it did. Then you have, I suppose, the forgotten machines. Alexandria was also home to the world's earliest engineers, men like who we talked about, Hero of Alexandria, who built automatic doors, coin-operated machines like vending machines, and even a kind of primitive steam engine called the alopile. I think I'm saying that right. I think I'm pronouncing it right. Alopile, something like that. So when you think about it, it's crazy. Like his surviving works suggest he was only even scratching the surface as well. So imagine what innovations might have followed had those experiments been pursued even further. Steam-powered ships or vehicles, perhaps centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Some of his designs were so advanced they were actually dismissed as myths and legends until modern replicas proved they actually worked. So if Hero's complete engineering manuals had survived, we might have inherited a world that industrialized under the Romans and not in the 18th century. Then you have, I suppose, lost medicine as well. Among the library's most valuable works were medical texts. You had physicians of Alexandria's famed medical school performed dissections and surgical procedures forbidden elsewhere. They studied the brain, the nervous system, the circulation, knowledge that would vanish for over 1,000 years after Rome's fall. So the work of Herophilus and Erastus, pioneers of anatomy, were said to be held in the library. They described the optic nerve, pulse measurement, the function of the heart, long before Harvey or Vesalius did. So those scrolls could have transformed medieval medicine, but instead, Europe would later rediscover the human body piece by piece in candlelit rooms, through forbidden dissections and dangerous trial and error as well. The library was also a centre for geographical research. It held the earliest attempts to map the known world and possibly even knowledge of lands beyond. Some historians believe Alexandrian scholars used trade reports from the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. They had accurate distances to sub Saharan Africa, Arabia, and to even China. There are even references, now these are unconfirmed references to Phoenician and Egyptian voyages beyond the Atlantic. So it's kind of tantalizing hints that ancient sailors may have reached far shores long before Columbus. But again, it's unconfirmed references. We don't know for sure. So whether these claims are true, we'll never know because the records are gone. And then there are, I suppose, the human voices we'll never hear either. The poets, philosophers, historians whose works didn't survive. We know that hundreds of Greek dramatists, only a handful remain. Of the vast corpus of Greek philosophy, I think it's roughly 10% has reached us, if even that. Entire schools of thought vanished. The cynics of the atomists, the early skeptics, all of these things are gone. So imagine the lost epics, the forgotten histories, the treatises that could have reshaped how we see the ancient world. The library's destruction didn't just erase information, in essence, it erased memory. So it tore pages from the story of humanity that can, never be rewritten as well. If the library had survived, if its scrolls had been copied, studied, and preserved through the ages, now I know it did by the Arabs as well, but again, a lot of it was lost before the Arabs got there. I think the world might have been, a change beyond recognition. The Renaissance might have begun, 1,000 years earlier. The Industrial Revolution might have been born in the Roman Empire. And I think humanity's understanding of the cosmos, of physics, medicine, mathematics, might have advanced by centuries. I think they really would have. So instead, we basically started over after the fall of the Roman Empire and with the burning of Alexandria and so many other things as well, but they're just to name a few. We rediscovered that truths had already been known. We climbed back up a mountain our ancestors had already scaled, I think. I think the maps of it somewhat lost in fire and time. And yet something did survive. Not the scrolls, not the buildings, but the idea behind them. I think that knowledge, once gathered, should be shared. I think that the human mind, when curious and free, can, touch the infinite, in my opinion. In every university, every library, every search engine, the spirit of Alexandria, I think, still lingers there as well. For example, every scientist, every student, every dreamer reaching beyond their time, they are all descendants of that ancient flame. The Library of Alexandria may have burned, but its light never really went out. So let's just talk about even the end as we're closing here now. This is the last bit I'm going to talk about. It was, I think, in the silence after the flames, Alexandria endured. The scrolls were gone, the scholars scattered, but the dream lingered like embers beneath the ash, basically. The dream of gathering all human knowledge in one place, of understanding the world through study and reason, could not be destroyed. It was too powerful, it was too human. Even as Alexandria's great halls crumbled, the world carried fragments of its light. In Byzantium, monks and scribes copied what few ancient texts survived. In Baghdad, during the 9th century, scholars built, the House of Wisdom that we talked about. A beautiful, magnificent library and translation center inspired in part by Alexandria's example. It was there in Baghdad, thinkers like Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Razi, and Averroes preserved Greek philosophy, improved upon it as well, and passed it on to Europe centuries later. They translated works of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, and in doing so became the bridge between, I think, ancient science and the modern world. They could fuse both of them and make the best out of it. The flame had passed east, flickering but, unbroken in a sense. And it was by the 12th century when these texts returned to Europe through Islamic Spain and Sicily. They sparked a slow and brilliant awakening. Scholars at Salerno, Toledo, and Paris rediscovered the logic of Aristotle, the geometry of Euclid, the medicine of Galen. And every university that rose in the medieval world was, in a way, I think, a descendant of Alexandria, in my opinion. It was like a new temple to knowledge built upon its ruins. But as the centuries turned, curiosity once again became sacred. The Renaissance, that rebirth of art and reason, was the moment Alexandria's ghost stirred once more. Thinkers like, Da Vinci, Copernicus, and Galileo echoed the Alexandrian ideal to observe, to experiment, and to question. And when Leonardo sketched the anatomy of human body, he was following in the footsteps of Hero. When Copernicus placed the sun at the center of the solar system, he revived, Aristarchus's long forgotten vision. And when Galileo built his telescope, he was continuing a legacy of observation that began under the Egyptian sun almost 2,000 years before. So, and with each discovery, I think the world has unknowingly fulfilled Alexandria's dream, not through preservation, but through rebirth, renaissance. You fast forward to the 20th century, the Mediterranean is quiet again, well, until recently, and the city of Alexandria stands rebuilt, modern, bustling, layered with history. In the late 20th century, actually, an idea began to take shape, and the question was asked: what if the Library of Alexandria could be reborn? Not as a monument to the past necessarily, but as a living beacon of global knowledge. And it was in 2002, I think it was 2002, 2001. I think it was 2002 that dream became real. The Biblioteca Alexandrina opened its doors. It's a vast, modern complex built beside the ancient harbour where the original library once stood. Its architecture is a statement of, purpose. Massive sunlit disc tilted toward the sea, carved with letters from every known language to humanity. It holds millions of books, digital, manuscript, archives. It's not just a building, really. It's a symbol when you think about it. That the pursuit of knowledge, though interrupted, can always begin again. I think the Biblioteca Alexandria stands as both a tribute and, in my opinion, a warning. A tribute to human curiosity and a warning about how easily the curiosity can be silenced. Because even today, knowledge faces new kinds of fire. Misinformation spreads faster than truth. Censorship and digital decay threaten our collective memory. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria isn't just an event of the past, it's a mirror of what could happen again in different forms. But unlike the scholars of old, we now have the power to protect our wisdom, not on fragile papyrus, but in data that circles the globe in seconds. The modern world carries, I think, Alexandria's dream in every connected mind. So the story of the Library of Alexandria isn't one of just loss alone. It's a story of, I think, endurance, of how an idea survived across centuries of darkness. From the scrolls of Egypt to the servers of the internet, humanity has always fought to remember, to record, to understand. And each generation builds its own library of books, of stories, of code, adding to the great conversation that began thousands of years ago on the shores of the Mediterranean. And perhaps somewhere in that continuum, the spirit of those ancient scholars still whispers. And that is to seek knowledge, protect it, share it. And that ultimately is what was never lost. The Library of Alexandria may have burned, but the fire that consumed it became a light. And it's a light that still guides us even now. Thank you everyone for listening to the show. And if you want something that you are interested in covering, drop me a text and I'll try and cover it as well. I'm a huge fan of world history and researching it all as well. So yeah, please drop a comment. And if you do enjoy the show, consider supporting the show on Patreon as well. And this is a big shout out to Dennis, who was my first Patreon subscriber. From Cork in Ireland. So thanks, Dennis. Thanks a million for that. And yeah, to everyone, if you enjoy listening to it, or if you follow me on social media, you can see a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about as well. Done a lot of stuff in Ireland lately, and I will cover more on my travels as well. I have some stuff that I still want to share with you from like Syria and Iraq. So yeah, I hope you like the show, and again, see you next week. Take care.